Recording.
Okay.
All right. Hello, listeners. This is Sydney again, and I'm here with Mikey Ward. Hello, Mikey.
Hi, Steve.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course, I'm excited. So, if you just want to start by introducing yourself, telling us who you are and what you do, and those types of things.
Yeah. Mikey Ward. I'm an RD, so residence director at Greenville University. I'm married to Sarah Ward, formerly Groves, and we have a son, Ezra, who's 9.5 months old now. I'm also an adjunct professor in the theology department, so I teach a couple classes a year there. Um, Hobbies. I like to run, and so if you're at Greenville, you've probably seen me running, uh, either to class or to um, uh, out to get off campus. Um, Interesting little known facts is I played football while I was at Greenville. I'm an alum of Greenville, formerly Greenville College, and this place transformed my life in a lot of ways. So um, I'm originally from up north, about 4 hours near Augustana College, and I saw Greenville for the first time when they played Augie when I was a junior in high school, and the rest is history.
Cool. Sweet. So, we are just going to start off by just a simple question of how do you define community? When you hear that word, what comes to mind? What's your textbook definition?
Mm.
And then what are your feelings when you hear that word?
Yeah. I'll start with my connotations. As a Greenville person, I've heard it for almost a decade, and that's a buzzword. But when I get into conversations with people and they use it, I realize that they really don't have a definition for it. They know what it is, but uh, in some ways, subjectively, but objectively or with a concise definition, it's you ask every single member of Greenville's community, and you're going to get a different definition. So I would say for myself, my experience of Greenville has determined my definition of community in a lot of ways. I think back to the first time I was on campus, and when I talk to students, they echo this: the sense of peace that you experience while on campus, walking while on tour, and the weird experience of everyone saying hello to you while you're on campus. And it's quickly lost on students how unique that is. And they lose, once you're in the midst of the community, you lose sight of what's good and what stood out to you while you were discerning which university to go to. And so I draw back on that experience and what I felt. Now, my 4 years, you asked me a different phase in my career, and it was a totally different definition in how I felt. At times, I was pissed off by the community. At times, I wept alongside community members. At times, I didn't want to have to do with anything in regards to the word community. And really, there's this notion of this loop of renewal of in many ways, I loved the community my freshman year. My sophomore year into my junior year, I became very cynical and judgmental of the word community. And by the end of my senior year, I grew to love the community. And so if I were to define it for students today, for someone listening, I would say it's comprised of subjective individuals who have had unique experiences, who hopefully come together and put aside their personal agendas for the sake of others and it attempts to glorify God. We're always going to fall short of that, but I think Um, One of my theology professors here at Greenville said, 90% of life is showing up, and Greenville's community has consistently shown up for me. And so showing up and trusting in the people of God to be the people of God.
Yeah, I really like, I mean, because you say it's a buzzword and it really is. Like, even when I was like saying to you, like, hey, Mikey, you want to talk about community? It's very, you never know what kind of reaction you might get from that word, just
Sure.
because community is something that means something different to people, because it depends on what community they come from and what community they're currently in, and that experience to really define it for them. And so, I will agree that it is a buzzword, and I like what you said about how it was for it changed for you as you went through college. Community is not a stagnant term that often we kind of at first glance it's like, oh, community, like you said, you know what that is, but it's constantly changing and evolving and growing. And so I like what you said there. So you went to college at Greenville. Can you talk about how, like, what it was like then, and like now that you work for Greenville, like what it's like now and how it's changed, and maybe some things that you like or don't like about how it's changed, or
Sure.
just stuff like that, how the community has evolved since your time as a student?
Sure. I'll start with just some things that I've observed, maybe about myself and the community since being back. I think Greenville's a small town, rural setting, and so there's a blessing and a curse in that you can know something about everyone without knowing them. And so this will lead into my recommendations for students later. But you it's a curse to write someone off and to assume that you know everything about them and assume and conclude what those individuals are going to say, or um, just determining who those individuals are and who they're going to be. And I've called out quite a few students in my time as an RD in many ways, because thankfully people did this to me when I was a student. Of I would say, you're speaking pretty authoritatively about this person, or objectively, like you know them. Like, have you ever had a conversation with them? No. Do you know anything about their life experience? Not really. Like, well, why do you say this X about this person? Well, just the way that they look, and I see them in the DC, like I've just concluded that I this about them. Okay, like let's deconstruct that a little bit. That seems really problematic. So that's a curse, and so my thing is, like, you need to go have a conversation with that person before you are going to speak about those individuals to other people in the community, because you're, from having no experiences with them, you're going to determine someone else's thoughts about said person.
Yeah, I find myself guilty of that from time to time. And I think it is beneficial to have someone that you can trust to say, like, well, why do you think that about that person? Like, you're making assumptions. Those aren't facts. Go
Yep.
talk to them, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Um, so thankfully, I had some friends who were, I'm going to use, my students are going to laugh at me, but a term that I was introduced to by one of my professors here at Greenville, John Brittingham. He talks about being friends of the good, and that's an Aristotle term. Aristotle has 3 definitions of friendship. And a friend of the good is a person who has the ultimate goal or ultimate end in mind and keeps one another accountable to that ultimate goal or ultimate end. And so I lived off campus for 2 years, and we did something of a intentional Christian community. And so we did morning prayer together. We did evening prayer. We had set aside meal times. We did a number of things. Sorry, Sydney.
it's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Gotta take care of Ezra.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and in the midst of those 2 years, I had some really low points, and I was extremely angry. And my friend group sat me down and had some really intentional conversations. And so it's community for me are people who are willing to keep each other accountable to their ultimate goal. And that doesn't always feel good. It humbles. It doesn't exalt one another at all times. And um, I think a thriving community is one that embraces the discomfort and is vulnerable. Much of my work as an RD has been defined by the work of Brene Brown, and her whole thing is on shame and vulnerability and what it takes to be courageous in the face of life. And I think what Greenville's community was for me in many ways was it called me to be vulnerable, even when I didn't feel like being
Mhm.
vulnerable, and reminded me or recentered me on what my goals were and helped me discern what my goals were and what my vocation was. So
Yeah.
it's very much a place that puts aside feelings and is willing to embrace the discomfort of reflection individually and communally. So
Yeah, yeah, that's good. You touched a little bit on your role as RD. Do you want to say anything more about how that plays into your view of community, what the community is like at Greenville, and especially within res life?
sure. So I'm residence director of Joy and Jansen halls, which are the traditional male residence halls. And so I'm over 160 guys, and I don't get to have intentional and meaningful interactions with all 160 guys, but I do get to with all the RAs. And something that we really talk about is the prevalence of um, hypermasculinity. We have a lot of athletes, and I embodied that when I was a student here, of toxic masculinity, and talking about how can we redeem what it means to be a man, redeeming masculinity. And a big part of that is we're told in our society that men aren't supposed to show their emotions, and they have to be tough and mentally tough for the sake of others. I just don't, that's not conducive for a healthy community. And so um, I think a big thing is within our halls. I talk about how with a residential education, like any campus, what's going on in the classrooms, professors and students are sowing seeds. They're just planting seeds every day. And the role of residential education is to live alongside one another and to pull the weeds, really. Someone has to plant the seeds, someone has to pull the weeds. And it's not fun to pull the weeds, but the RAs and the residence directors, that's really the goal. And you never know when the harvest is going to be. You never know when uh, said interactions will produce fruit, but you have to act faithfully and pull the weeds.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a cool analogy. Especially, I'll keep that in mind next year when I'm an RA.
yeah,
I won't forget that analogy.
yeah. And so that's like, that's really theoretical, or, um, but it really comes down to micro affirmations, remembering people's names,
Hmm.
and the rules of three. The first 3 minutes, the first 3 days, the first 3 weeks are the most important for building a community. And so I really emphasize doorstops within my two buildings. Thankfully, with Joy Jansen Hall, the doors naturally stay open, so they naturally have better communities. Now,
Hmm.
due to updated fire codes, Joy's doors naturally stay closed. And so at the beginning of the year, I hold up a doorstop and I say, this is the holiest thing in our community. This will determine who will have a strong sense of relationships with the individuals on their floor. There will be people on this floor who will be your lifetime friends, and it's because of this little tiny piece of plastic. Keep the doors open and allow those 30-second interactions to bear fruit to more long-term and meaningful connections.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so cool. So moving on to kind of the next thing for students listening, what advice do you have when they're trying to connect to their community in the middle of, a normal setting like we had before spring break, but
Yeah,
now that our world has erupted and we're now at home or by ourselves in our dorms, like we're all scattered everywhere. And we may have found peace, we may have not, we may just be ready to just be done and not be part of, kind of disconnect from the community a little bit and just take our own time. Or there's students listening that probably really desire a connection with their community and are feeling alone and just don't really know how to connect when they want to connect. So would you like to speak on just community in the midst of our world right now?
sure. That's difficult. I think GSGA and Res Life has experienced this in some ways. We've attempted to put out virtual programming, and I think we've lost sight of the fact that we're all grieving. And
Mm,
when you're grieving something, you don't always want to join another Zoom session. Um, and so it's difficult to, one, find meaningful connection, and two, I've been talking with one of my RAs about the disjointed way of connecting via Zoom.
mm-hmm,
You're perpetually realizing that a virtual connection is still lackluster. And so I think the biggest thing is, in order to connect well and find community, you need to do that with yourself, and reflect and put aside some time of naming the things that you're feeling. I think the temptation is to either attack your to-do list or to numb your grieving by scrolling the black hole of social media, to
mm-hmm.
just keep scrolling. And I think both are temporary goods, and so I think first off you have to name and just reflect, what am I experiencing? What am I feeling?
Mm-hmm.
And being able to name that, I think, allows you to transition to the next step of, like, how are other people feeling?
Mm-hmm.
And being intentional about reaching out to your close group of friends, either through a group chat or uh, through a one-on-one FaceTime, of just checking in and being intentional in that way. And I think the thing also, reaching out to your RDs, that we're grieving as well. Everybody who's on campus is grieving just the loss of the community being here in full force. Um, and um, finding a way to debrief together in a way that is worthwhile and doesn't alienate. Easier said than done.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think maybe reflecting on how this experience reveals what you appreciate about being embodied and being together as a community, and naming the things that maybe we've taken for granted, either individually or collectively,
Yeah.
and talking about those things.
Mm-hmm. I for sure
Um,
have felt this like sense of in-betweenness, kind of like in
yeah,
between grieving the loss of it and like trying to move forward and trying to move on and staying in that negative past reflection state, but also wanting to like still grow as a human being and as a college student. And so, yeah, I agree.
yeah, and I think you named the, like, how do I reflect when I've got all of these things that I'm perpetually forced to adapt and move on, but let's go back to this thing. Like I haven't fully recovered from this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it gives space to reflect on, like, collectively we don't carve out times and spaces in Greenville's community, but in our society for lament, and we don't emphasize lament enough. But when we look at scripture, it's comprised of two types. It's either lament or praise, um, and you can't have true praise without lament, and you can't have true lament without praise. And um, I think experiences like these, either whether we realize it or not, is sifting through what's important and what's insignificant. And I think this has taught me how significant lament is, and how I have no muscles for lamenting, and I don't do it well. And I don't do it well in a way that doesn't harm other people. And I need other people to teach me how to lament well in a way that I don't harm the person to my left and to my right.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate your perspective on that. It's really hard to keep yourself accountable to take the time to do that when we're not used to it. It's a complete adjustment and 180. So I guess we're all in this together,
Yeah. Yeah.
figuring it out.
And I think another hard thing is each of us are, and each of our families are experiencing different things right now. And I think there's a big fear of not saying the wrong thing or an alienating thing. Um, and but we can't do that work without just checking in and saying, hey, how are you doing? And not having that, the pocket change to trust that people are going to be vulnerable. You may say something in a Zoom class session that is totally alienating to a classmate or a friend, that their parent or their family member is in the midst of the virus or the financial toll or the economic toll.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it takes a lot of courage and wisdom and self-control to voice how you're feeling first off, and to trust that it will be received well, but to I don't know, engage one another in a way that you don't even know what their experience of this is.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. We're like, it's all the same for us because it's all like we're a community and the coronavirus is hitting us all. But we're not. Like, it's not affected me the same way it's affected you. And so we all kind of have to, I like what you said with like wisdom and self-control, like use those tools that we have to talk about it and know that we all are experiencing different things. But there's also this unique and really kind of interesting unity that can come from us sharing our differences and how we're dealing with it differently. All of that plays into building community and strengthening community during this time.
Yeah. It goes back to how can we show solidarity towards one another and although be spread across the country, continue to practice and try to embody what it means to be a community.
Yeah.
Virtually.
Yeah. So if you want to say anything else about specific things that GU is trying to, GU as in your area, GU as a whole, what are we doing to kind of set ourselves apart as a community, especially during this time, trying to support students, and this is about during this time, but it's also about before this even happened, and now eventually someday we're going to have to move on, turn the page, and take what we've learned from this time and apply it into our hopefully it's going to be different, but it's going to be a new sense of community. But it's still going to it's still there waiting for us, for those of us that aren't graduating. So would you like to touch on that and speak on kind of just what Greenville's doing to support?
Yeah. I can't speak collectively, but I can talk about my own experience and maybe my experience within our department.
Yeah.
Um, I think life is just a series of transitions, and once you get used to something, it's time for the next transition. But this is a collective transition. And so for many of the students who are in Greenville right now, their first memories were in the midst of a collective transition with 9/11. And I think this will eventually dwarf like the paradigm shifts that happened pre 9/11 and post 9/11. And so it it'll be interesting to see how things shift. I think one advantage that Greenville has is, when universities like Greenville were created on the cusp of the 20th century, the people who founded these universities were really intentional about finding rural communities. And for the last 100 years, that is found to be a detriment to those universities. But with COVID, it might go back to the original reason. And the original reason was parents wanted to find a safe place in the midst of um, uncertainty and safety within America's cities. They wanted to find a safe place or a walled garden. Some literature calls it a walled garden where the fruits of the Christian character could take root and to grow, and then students could be transplanted into the world. There's critiques to be made with the walled garden imagery, but in the midst of COVID, I think within rural communities, community like Greenville is set up from even its beginning points to provide a sense of security. And I think that's an advantage that I'll talk about, at least with my RAs and with higher ups too, is to say this is a rhetoric piece at our founding days that, because of this pandemic, is playing itself out in a way that maybe 5 years ago we would have seen this as a weakness, with not being able to draw students from more culturally relevant locations. I think another thing that Greenville students experience, whether they realize it or not, is that Greenville gives you time and space to ask yourself hard questions. They say there's nothing to do here. Well, there are people here, and you have time and space. And so you have time and space to cultivate those relationships. You have time to figure out who you are and what you've experienced, and in some ways heal, and to use this time to heal before you have to go back out into the world.
Yeah.
That's a privileged experience, but I think it's an experience that I've seen more times than not, and it's definitely my experience. And I think for myself, trying to find the balance of this not determining every single conversation explicitly but implicitly, and how can I talk about the changes that we're in the midst of without explicitly naming COVID-19, and being intentional and really hitting home the fullness of an experience that you're receiving from living in the residence halls alongside people who are learning the same things you are. And that we can you've had your fill of virtual connections. Let's go back to embodied connections for a little bit.
Yeah.
And find balance there. And I think the last thing is, hopefully I use this as an opportunity to figure out how to overcome myself and my own selfishness, and to be someone for the sake of others, and not doing something to kind of glorify myself or to add something to my CV, but to glorify God and to glorify others. And this is a visceral opportunity to practice that, and it's a visceral opportunity to experience like the gift that truly is. When higher education, it's competitive. It's let's add this to the CV. Let's figure out what the next step is in your career, and it's I think in some ways lends itself to the opposite of what a Christian liberal arts education is and ought to be. So
Yeah.
I rambled there. I apologize.
No, it's okay. I wanna go back and re-listen to it and write it down and unpack some of that stuff, because there's some good stuff there. It's just there's a lot to think about right now. So yeah, it's just a lot, but those are some good tidbits to kind of take away. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of give you the last word. If there's anything you'd like to add about this, any other pieces of advice or nuggets that you want to give to students, now is your
Um,
chance.
I would say I want to take the opportunity to thank you, Sydney,
Oh,
and the way that you've led Greenville and the student body through this time. I think I think you're someone who embodies embrace the discomfort, and very few people find themselves in the midst of leadership to this magnitude in such a paradigm forming moment. And um, and so I thank you for that. And um, yeah, I've just been really impressed by your leadership, and I hope that the student body and the community takes the opportunity to express similar gratitude. So
well,
thank you.
thank you. It's definitely been hard, and I don't think I could have done it. Well, it's not over. We're still going, but I don't think there's no way that I could do what I do without so many different people that speak into my experience, and I feel like an overwhelming sense of gratitude, um, just towards how people have poured into me and supported me in this role. And yeah, it's just been really crazy. But thank you. That was really kind. I appreciate it. Thank you for giving up your time this hour. I hope Ezra is doing great. I hope Sarah
Yeah.
is doing great. But yeah.
Well, thank you.